Hey there. Welcome to our deep dive, this time into the world of medieval syllogisms.
Oh, syllogisms.
Yeah, so, you might think at first glance syllogisms, that's pretty like Logic 101 stuff, right?
Yeah.
But trust me, the medieval philosophers, they really went deep with this. And we've got a great guide here, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, to take us through it. So get ready to go beyond Aristotle and see how they really pushed the boundaries of thought here.
It's amazing how these medieval philosophers took something that seems as simple as a three-part argument and developed incredibly complex systems around it. Like, it wasn't just logic games. They were dealing with fundamental questions about language and truth and reality.
Yeah, no kidding. So to set the stage, let's rewind a little bit back to Aristotle.
Mhm.
I mean, he's the one who kind of gave us this whole syllogism structure, right? Two premises and a conclusion.
Right.
But for you, what's the most important thing to understand about, Aristotle's way of thinking about syllogisms?
Well, I think for Aristotle, the key thing he realized was that the form of an argument, like the structure, the way the terms and the propositions are arranged, that determines if it's valid and not just what it's about.
Yeah, yeah.
So he really got into categorizing these syllogisms, creating this framework so you can analyze arguments systematically.
So it's not just about whether the premises are true, right? It's whether the conclusion, it has to follow from those premises based on the structure.
Yeah, exactly. And to do that, right, he organized syllogisms into these things called figures based on where the subject and the predicate and that middle term show up in the premises.
Right, right.
So he could say, okay, well, this form of argument, this is different from this one, even if they both seem kind of valid on the surface.
Yeah, and this gives us all these different valid argument types, like the famous one, Barbara.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
The classic.
The classic.
All men are mortal. Socrates is a man. Therefore, Socrates is mortal.
Right.
It seems so simple when you say it like that. But there's a lot going on in terms of the logical machinery.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And what's really cool is he used these basic syllogisms to create a hierarchy of syllogisms.
Oh, okay.
He's some of these, the ones in the first figure, they're self-evident.
Okay.
And you can use those to prove the less obvious ones.
Wow.
Using these cool techniques like conversion and reductio ad absurdum.
So it's not just he's putting them in categories. He's creating a system where some of them are the foundation for proving the others.
Yeah, exactly. It's
Yeah.
incredibly sophisticated for the time, showing how you can analyze and systematize our reasoning.
Yeah. So we've got this great foundation from Aristotle. And then fast forward a few centuries to the Middle Ages, and things get really interesting because medieval philosophers, they get a hold of Aristotle's work, but they don't just accept it passively, right?
Right.
They start playing with it, taking it in all sorts of new directions.
They were handed this logical toolkit and told, okay, let's see what you can build.
Yeah, exactly.
And they were creative, rigorous. They questioned even Aristotle's most basic ideas.
Yeah, and so we have a figure like Boethius, right? Super important for preserving all this ancient knowledge. He seems like a bridge between that ancient world and the medieval world.
Absolutely. Boethius did a lot to bring Aristotle's logic to the Latin West.
Right.
But it's interesting how he made these subtle changes to the language of the syllogisms.
Okay.
Instead of saying belongs to, he would use is, which subtly changes how we think about the relationships.
Oh, that's fascinating. So even those little language tweaks can have these big implications for how we understand the logic itself.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
Let's take that Aristotle example with Socrates. Instead of mortality belongs to all men, Boethius would say, all men are mortal.
Right.
Seems like a small thing, but it kind of shifts the focus to the inherent properties of things.
Right.
Instead of just the relationship between categories.
Yeah, that is a subtle but important shift in emphasis.
Yeah.
And it kind of sets the stage for these later medieval thinkers to dig even deeper into that relationship between logic and metaphysics.
Exactly. But here's another twist. While the Latin West was rediscovering Aristotle through folks like Boethius, you have Arabic scholars who are also pushing the boundaries of logic completely independently,
Oh, wow.
developing their own systems that go beyond Aristotle in fascinating ways.
So it's there's this parallel development happening in both the Latin West and the Arabic world. It's two branches of the same logical family tree.
Exactly. And one of the big names in the Arabic tradition is Avicenna, just a brilliant mind who made huge contributions to philosophy, medicine, and of course, logic.
Avicenna, yeah, the polymath, from what I've read, he was really into the concepts of necessity and possibility. How did that influence his approach to logic?
Well, Avicenna, he was all about modal logic, the study of necessity and possibility.
Right.
He believed even simple statements about the world, they could be analyzed through this modal lens. It's like
Oh.
you can reveal these hidden layers of meaning.
So instead of just saying, like, all birds have wings, he might ask, is it necessary that all birds have wings, or is it just possible?
Exactly. He even applied this modal thinking to assertoric sentences, the ones that are usually thought of as non-modal.
Okay.
So it's a philosophical shift, recognizing that logic isn't just about what's true, but about what must be true or what could be true.
Right.
It brings logic and metaphysics closer.
Yeah, it's like he's saying that logic is, like, fundamentally connected to how we understand the nature of reality.
Precisely. And Avicenna, he didn't stop there. He explored what he called descriptional sentences. They had these qualifying phrases like while B. So like every B is A while
Oh, my
B.
brain's doing like a logic dance, trying to picture that.
Yeah, it's a whole other dimension to syllogistic reasoning.
It sounds like he's opening up all these new avenues for logical exploration.
Totally. He was a true innovator. And on top of that, he developed these new categories for syllogisms, connective and repetitive, kind of similar to Aristotle's categorical and hypothetical syllogisms, but with more nuance.
So we've got all this exciting stuff happening in both the Latin West and the Arabic world, with philosophers riffing off of Aristotle, challenging his ideas, being really creative.
Absolutely. And as we move into the 12th century, we meet another big name in the Latin West, Peter Abelard, brilliant philosopher, scandalous love affair with Heloise, and major contributions to logic.
Yeah, Abelard, the rock star logician of his time, but he wasn't all talk, right? He actually made some significant advances in syllogistic logic.
Yeah.
What stands out to you as his, like, biggest achievement?
We know it's amazing that even without having Aristotle's prior analytics directly,
Right.
Abelard managed to boil down syllogistic reasoning to these 9 clear rules,
Wow.
capturing how terms can relate to each other in a valid syllogism.
So it's like he reverse engineered Aristotle's system, figuring out those underlying principles that make the whole thing work.
Exactly, and his insights were super profound. His first 2 rules are basically the principles of class inclusion that became like fundamental later on, the Dicidi omni et nulla rules.
Okay, so he was setting the rules for how we can talk about all and none in a way that makes logical sense.
Exactly. It's a big deal. And Abelard didn't stop there. He made another major contribution. He clearly distinguished between de dicto and de re modal sentences.
Or de dicto and de re essential concepts in modal logic,
Yeah.
but always a bit tricky to wrap your head around. Could you remind us what that distinction is?
Sure, it's all about where you apply that modal operator, like necessarily or possibly. The dicto sentences, they attribute the necessity or possibility to the whole statement itself. So it is necessary that all bachelors are unmarried.
That's de dicto, because you're saying the whole proposition is necessarily true.
Okay, so it's about the truth of the saying. What about de re?
The re sentences, they apply the necessity or possibility to the thing itself.
Okay.
So every bachelor is necessarily unmarried. That's de re,
Yeah.
because you're saying something about the nature of being a bachelor.
Okay, so de dicto is about the truth of the sentence, and de re is about how things are in the world.
Yeah, helpful distinction.
Yeah, super helpful. And Abelard making that clear was really important for modal logic. Now, philosophers could analyze modality and predication with way more precision.
Okay, so Abelard really shakes things up with his clarity and innovative thinking. What happens next in our logic saga?
Well, as more of Aristotle's work becomes available, especially the prior analytic scholars in the Latin West are faced with a new challenge reconciling these rediscovered texts with what they've already been doing.
Oh, so they're like, wait a minute, does what we've been building actually line up with what Aristotle said in the first place?
Exactly. And one of the key figures in this rescue mission was Robert Kilwardby, 13th century philosopher theologian. He even became the Archbishop of Canterbury.
Kilwardby, wow, he was a big deal in the intellectual world back then. How did he approach this whole reconciling Aristotle with the medieval tradition thing?
Well, Kilwardby really focused on Aristotle's modal syllogistic, which, as we've seen, can be pretty puzzling, full of these apparent contradictions.
Yeah.
He wanted to show that Aristotle's system could be made consistent and that it actually matched up with what medieval logicians had already been doing.
That sounds like a pretty ambitious project. How did he go about doing that?
Well, one of his main moves was to use the distinction between per se and per accidens necessity.
Okay.
Remember, per se, necessity is about something being necessary because of its very nature,
Right.
while per accidens necessity is about something being necessary because of external factors.
Right, like a triangle having 3 sides, that's per se, But me sitting in this chair right now, that's just per accident.
Exactly. And Kilwardby applied this to syllogistic sentences. He argued that only sentences expressing per se necessity were really convertible. You could swap the subject and the predicate without changing the truth.
Oh, so he's bringing in these metaphysical considerations to help clarify these logical principles.
Exactly. He was suggesting that logic and metaphysics, they're deeply connected.
Right.
Which raises a big question. Can we actually separate logic from metaphysics?
Yeah.
Is logic ultimately grounded in the way things are?
That's a deep question that people are still debating even today. Yep.
Absolutely. And Kilwardby's work shows how these seemingly technical discussions about syllogisms can have huge implications for how we understand knowledge and reality and how they relate.
So Killerby gave it his best shot trying to harmonize Aristotle with the medieval tradition. But it sounds like there were still some loose ends.
Yeah, there were, and not everyone was convinced by Kilwardby's approach. One of his most insightful critics was Richard of Campsall, another logician from that time who took Kilwardby's ideas and pushed them even further.
Camsell, he's not as well known, but it sounds like he was doing some really interesting work. What was his main disagreement with Kilwardby?
Campsall agreed with Kilwardby that this per se versus per accidens distinction, it was key for understanding modal syllogisms, but he thought Kilwardby hadn't gone far enough.
Okay.
He wanted an even stricter rule for how we interpret modal terms in those sentences.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What was this radical new rule?
He argued that the supposition of terms, what they refer to in modal sentences, it should only apply to things that exist right now in that moment.
Hold on, so he's saying when we talk about possibilities in a syllogism, we're only talking about possibilities that could actually happen right now.
Basically, and that had some really interesting implications.
Like, what? Give me an example.
Well, for one, it let him validate more of Aristotle's modal syllogisms, which was his goal.
Okay.
But it also led him to question this idea of the necessity of the present.
Yeah.
This idea that what exists now must necessarily exist.
Whoa, so he's like opening up the possibility of other realities, or at least other possibilities existing at the same time as the present moment.
Yeah, it's like he's anticipating some of the stuff we see in modern physics and modal logic with this whole concept of possible worlds.
That's mind-blowing. We started with these simple three-part arguments, and now we're talking about a whole universe of possibilities.
Exactly. Campsall shows how these debates about logic, they make us rethink time and reality and what's possible.
So we've got Aristotle, Boethius, Avicenna, Abelard, Killerby, Campsall, all these brilliant minds grappling with syllogisms, pushing the boundaries of logical thought. It's quite a lineage.
It is, and as we move into the later Middle Ages, we meet a figure who's probably best known for his idea of simplicity. William of Ockham, the man behind Occam's razor.
Occam, yeah. Isn't he all about simplicity that seems kind of different from these increasingly complex systems we've been discussing?
Well, that's the funny thing. While Occam is known for advocating simplicity, his work on logic actually brings in more nuances to the discussion of modal syllogistic. You see, by his time, the focus had shifted a little from syllogisms themselves to this broader idea of consequences.
Okay.
This notion that some statements they logically follow from others.
So it's not just about the syllogistic form itself anymore. It's about understanding the whole web of logical relationships.
Exactly. But even with that shift in emphasis, Occam still thought syllogisms were really important, like a key part of this larger logical system.
Right.
He saw them as this basic building block for figuring out how we get conclusions from premises, and he really clarified the distinction between composite and divided modal sentences. Using ideas from the theory of supposition, how terms refer to things in different contexts.
So Occam's like, hold on, let's be really clear about what we mean when we use these modal terms in our syllogisms.
That's a great way to put it. He wanted to ensure that every term was being used in a consistent and logically sound way. And to do this, he introduced this idea of ampliated versus non-ampliated subjects,
Okay.
which further refined how we understand the function of modal terms. Like, for example, he argued that in divided modal sentences, the subject term could be ampliated to refer not just to actual things, but also to possible things.
Wait, so are we back to this idea of quantifying over possibility, something that Campsell was exploring too?
Exactly. Occam's work shows how these themes keep popping up and evolving throughout medieval logic.
Right.
Philosophers are constantly refining their understanding of modal terms and how they operate in arguments.
It's amazing to see how these ideas build on each other, how each thinker adds something new to the conversation.
It really is. And there's more. We haven't even talked about John Buridan yet, often considered like the ultimate architect of late medieval logic.
Okay.
His work is the culmination of centuries of logical inquiry. It shows just how sophisticated and powerful these systems of reasoning could become.
Darren, yeah, he's a fascinating figure from what I've read. He basically took everything that came before him and turned it into this incredibly comprehensive and elegant system.
Absolutely. Buridan was a true master of logic. He took the ideas of Aristotle, Avicenna, Abelard, Occam, all the greats, and he wove them together into a unified framework
Wow.
that was both rigorous and expansive.
That's an incredible achievement.
Right.
What would you say is his most significant contribution?
Well, one of his key innovations was fully integrating syllogistic logic into this broader theory of formal consequences. Remember that idea that the validity of an argument hinges on its logical form, not the specific content.
Right, so if a certain structure is valid, any argument using that structure is also valid no matter what the argument's about.
Exactly. Buridan saw syllogisms as a type of formal consequence, this structure that guarantees a valid inference. And he brought in his theory of distribution to explain how terms relate in these syllogistic structures. Remember, a term is distributed in a sentence if it refers to everything. It signifies like when it's in the scope of a universal quantifier.
Right, like in all humans are mortal, the term humans is distributed because it's talking about all humans.
Precisely.
But in some humans or philosophers, it's not distributed because it's only talking about some.
Exactly. Buridan used these ideas about distribution to analyze different syllogism forms and see which ones were actually valid. And what's really interesting is that through this analysis, he ended up accepting more valid syllogistic forms than Aristotle did.
Wait, so Aristotle missed some?
Well, it's not that he missed them, it's more that Buridan expanded the system, allowing for things like indirect conclusions where the subject and predicate of the conclusion are flipped. And he worked with sentences that had slightly different structures than Aristotle's classic forms. He ended up with 38 valid moods compared to Aristotle's 24.
Wow, 14 extra ways to make a valid syllogism. Buridan really pushed the boundaries of the system.
He did, but it doesn't stop there. Buridan also explored temporal syllogisms,
Okay.
where the time element is built into the sentences, and oblique syllogisms, which involve statements about relationships, not just subjects and predicates.
Oh, wow.
He was always expanding what syllogistic logic could handle.
So he's taking this basic framework and applying it to all these new and complex scenarios.
Exactly, and that's not all, remember, modal logic, that
Mhm.
system dealing with necessity, possibility, contingency. Well, Buridan took Occam's work on this and ran with it, creating this amazingly sophisticated system for analyzing nodal syllogisms.
Okay, that was the stuff that was making my head spin earlier.
Yeah.
So how did Buridan tackle this modal madness?
He began by expanding the classic square of opposition, which maps out the relationships between different types of statements, into a full-blown octagon. This allowed him to represent these complex relationships between modal sentences with incredible accuracy.
An octagon of opposition. That sounds intense.
It is, but it's also a testament to Buridan's logical brilliance. He managed to create a system that could handle the subtleties of modal language like no one before him. He developed a detailed set of rules and consequences for modal syllogisms, accounting for all these subtle variations in how modal terms can work. His system was so advanced, some scholars think it foreshadowed modern modal logic, even hinting at the concept of possible worlds.
Okay, now that is mind-blowing. We started with Aristotle's simple three-part deductions, and now we're talking about a system that's almost predicting the future of logic.
It's a testament to the power of human thought. These medieval logicians, they took a seemingly simple concept and explored it with amazing rigor and creativity.
So what does this mean for us regular folks who aren't medieval logic experts? Why should we care about these old syllogisms?
Because they're not just about old books, they're about the core structures of how we reason as humans. By understanding how these logical systems work, we can become more aware of our own thinking and how to analyze and assess arguments, whether we're reading philosophy, debating politics, or just trying to win an argument with a friend.
That's a good point.
Yeah.
This wasn't just about history. It was about understanding the power and potential of logic itself.
Exactly. And I'll leave you with a final thought. Imagine taking Buridan's modal logic and using it for something like artificial intelligence. Could his system, which was so good at handling complexity and nuance,
Right.
could it help us design AI systems that can reason about possibility and uncertainty in a more sophisticated way? It's a question worth considering.
Yeah, it is. It's funny because while Occam, he's famous for wanting simplicity, his
Okay.
work on logic actually made the whole discussion of modal syllogistic even more nuanced.
Oh, really?
Yeah, you see, by his time, the focus was kind of moving away from just syllogisms to this bigger idea of consequences.
Okay.
The idea that some statements have to logically follow from others. Right, right, right.
But even though the emphasis was shifting, Occam still thought syllogisms were super important.
Yeah.
He saw them as like this fundamental piece of the puzzle for understanding how we go from premises to conclusion.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And he did a lot to clarify the difference between composite and divided modal sentences.
Okay.
He used ideas from the theory of supposition, which is all about how terms refer to things in different situations.
Right.
It's like Occam was saying, hey, let's be super precise about what we actually mean when we throw these modal terms into our syllogisms.
Yeah, like let's get specific.
Exactly. He wanted to make sure every term was being used consistently and rigorously. And to do that, he introduced this idea of ampliated versus non-ampliated subjects,
Okay.
which further refined how we think about modal terms working. Like, he argued that in divided modal sentences, the subject term could be ampliated. So it refers not only to things that actually exist, but also to possible things.
Wait, so we're back to quantifying over possibilities like Campbell was doing?
Exactly. Occam's work shows how these themes just keep popping up and evolving throughout medieval logic.
Yeah, it's like a recurring motif.
Philosophers are constantly tweaking and improving their understanding of these modal terms and how they fit into arguments.
And how they all work together. It's amazing to see how these ideas build on each other, each thinker adding their own piece to the conversation.
It really is. And there's one more giant we need to talk about, John Bearden.
Okay.
He's often considered like the master architect of late medieval logic. His work really represents the peak of centuries of logical inquiry.
Wow.
It shows how sophisticated and powerful these systems of reasoning could get.
That's incredible. Yeah. Bearden, he's always fascinated me. I mean, from what I've read, he took everything that came before him and synthesized it into this amazingly comprehensive and elegant system.
That's exactly right. Bearden was a true logic master. He took the ideas of Aristotle, Avicenna, Abelard, Occam, you name it, and wove them into this unified framework that was both rigorous and far-reaching.
That's a huge accomplishment.
Mm.
What do you think his most significant contribution was?
Well, one of his biggest innovations was to completely integrate syllogistic logic into this broader theory of formal consequences. Remember that idea that an argument's validity depends only on its form, not on the specific content of its statements.
Right. So if a certain structure works, any argument using that structure will also work regardless of what it's actually about.
Exactly. Bearden saw syllogisms as just one type of formal consequence, a specific structure that guarantees a valid inference.
Okay.
And he brought in his theory of distribution to explain how terms relate to each other in these syllogistic structures. You see, a term is distributed in a sentence if it refers to absolutely everything. It signifies like when it's in the scope of a universal quantifier.
Right. So like in all humans are mortal, the term humans is distributed because we're talking about all humans.
Yes. Exactly.
But in some humans or philosophers, it's not distributed because it's only some humans.
Precisely, Bearden used these ideas about distribution to analyze all these different forms of syllogisms and see which ones actually held up logically. And what's fascinating is that through this rigorous analysis, he ended up accepting more valid syllogistic forms than Aristotle did.
Oh, wow. More so Aristotle missed some.
Well, not really miss more. Like, Bearden expanded the whole system. He allowed for things like indirect conclusions where you flip the subject and predicate in the conclusion.
Okay.
And he worked with sentences that had slightly different structures than Aristotle's classic forms. He ended up with 38 valid moods compared to Aristotle's 24.
14 extra ways to make a valid syllogism that's amazing. Bearden really pushed the limits of the system.
He did, but that wasn't all. He also looked into temporal syllogisms where time is built right into the sentence.
Okay, wow.
And oblique syllogisms, these involve statements about relationships, not just subjects and predicates.
Wow, he was really exploring every nook and cranny of logic.
He was constantly pushing the boundaries of what syllogistic logic could handle.
So taking this basic framework and applying it to all these new complex scenarios.
Yeah, exactly. And there's more. Remember modal logic, the one that deals with necessity and possibility and contingency.
Yeah.
Well, Bearden took Occam's work in that area and ran with it. He created this incredibly sophisticated system for analyzing modal syllogisms.
That was the stuff that was giving me a headache earlier.
Yeah.
So how did Bearden approach that modal madness?
Well, he started by taking the classic square of opposition, the one that maps out the relationships between different types of statements.
Right.
And he expanded it into a full-fledged octagon.
An octagon of opposition. That sounds pretty intense.
It is,
Oh,
but it's
wow.
also a testament to Verity's genius. He managed to create a system that could handle all those subtleties of modal language in a way that no one had done before.
Wow.
He also developed a whole set of rules and consequences for modal syllogisms, accounting for all these tiny variations in how modal terms can function. His system was so advanced, some scholars think it foreshadowed modern modal logic, even hinting at the concept of possible worlds.
Okay, now that is mind-blowing.
Hmm.
We started with Aristotle's simple three-part deductions,
Yeah.
and we've ended up with a system that's practically predicting the future of logic.
Yeah.
Amazing.
It really shows the power of human thought. These medieval logicians, they took a seemingly simple concept and explored it with such incredible rigor and creativity.
So what does all this mean for us, regular people who aren't medieval logic experts? Why should we care about these old syllogisms?
Because they're not just about old books. They're about the fundamental ways that we reason as humans.
Yeah.
By understanding how these logical systems work, we can become more aware of our own thinking and better equipped to analyze and evaluate arguments, whether we're reading philosophy or debating politics or just trying to win an argument with a friend.
Exactly. This wasn't just a history lesson. It was about giving us a new perspective on logic itself and its power and potential.
And to leave you with one last thought, imagine taking Burden's modal logic and applying it to something like artificial intelligence.
Mhm.
Could his system, which was so good at handling complexity and nuance, could it help us design AI systems that can reason about possibility and uncertainty in a more sophisticated way?
That's a really interesting question, something to think about.
It is food for thought.
Well, that wraps up our deep dive into the world of medieval syllogisms. We hope you enjoyed the journey and maybe learned a thing or two about the enduring power of logic.